Not coincidentally, this has been one of the most Brazilian conferences I've ever been at, in it we have successfully started every session later and ended later than we intended. And I am very pleased to bring a little bit of Brasilidade to this otherwise cool, temperate part of the North American continent. It's my great pleasure to introduce my colleague Paige Rabeman from the History Department, who's going to be introducing our closing speaker, Taiaiake Alfred, who has joined us from the University of Victoria in Vancouver Island, and I'm very much looking forward to his reflections from his own perspective and his own research and his own activism on some of these larger questions of indigeneity, of the exchange of knowledge, and other themes that he sees fit to expound upon. So we're going to have about 30-40 minutes, and there's not necessarily going to be a question and answer unless people are absolutely dying to ask something, in which case jump up when he finishes. So without further ado.
Okay, thanks, Neil. I'm not going to say too much here. I know it's the end of a long and stimulating few days for most people, but I was very pleased when Neil asked me whether I would introduce Taiaiake Alfred to everybody here this evening. If you haven't heard him speak before, you're in for a treat, and many of you might be here because you have heard him speak before. He, a few years ago, spoke to one of my undergraduate classes here at UBC and packed the room with additional speakers and energized everybody who heard him that day. He is self-described on his website as an author, educator, and activist who was raised in the Kahnawake Mohawk territory, but as many of you may know, he currently lives in Saanich on Vancouver Island and works at the University of Victoria as the founding director of a really innovative program at the School of Indigenous Governance that's housed at UVic, which, if you're not familiar with, would be something worth taking a look at. He's the author of a number of different books, of 3 books, and many other sort of different pieces of writing and articles. His books include Heeding the Voices of Our Ancestors, Peace, Power, and Righteousness, and Wasase. He hinted to me earlier he's on to a new project about which I don't have enough to tell you anything about. He has a variety of wide other sort of activities that he's been involved in. He served in the US Marine Corps. He's written widely and received articles from, or awards from, the Native American Journalists Association, a National Aboriginal Achievement Award in Canada, and also served as an advisor to a variety of First Nations governments and community organizations. So he's a very broad-ranging thinker and writer who's always, in my experience, extremely provocative when he speaks. So let's give him a warm welcome.
Sego's gonna go Nyago, a page for that introduction. It's always great to be here among my friends, the Musqueam Nation, and people that I know at UBC, and former students, and all of you tonight, to share some thoughts in closing on one of the themes that I think has been running through, as I understand, from the beginning of the conference until right now at the end, which is a consideration, in addition to all the other things you've been talking about, of indigeneity and the meaning of indigeneity as it relates to some of the themes that you've been talking about. I do realize that you've been here quite a while today, and Neil did remind me, you know, that he demanded a lot of you guys, and you really stepped up, and people have really put a lot into the conference. So don't worry, if you're looking at the program, I'm not going to lecture for an hour, and I'm going to try to keep it engaging and actually a bit reflective this time in terms of what I have to say about indigeneity. I mean, There are some people here, as Paige kind of alluded to, that have heard me speak before, and there's some people that have heard me speak 4, 5, 6, 10, 20 times. So I don't want to kind of go into the books that I've written or anything like that. What I want to do is really offer you some thoughts on what the contestations are on this notion of indigeneity as they're playing out in Canada and North America today. It's what's really, I think, present in the minds of so many people, especially in the last couple of weeks as it's been kind of manifested in these displays of indigeneity in part of the Olympics. You know, and I think that I'm here in Vancouver. The Olympics were just here. The Paralympics are ongoing. There is an active effort on the part of Indigenous people on so many levels to move away from the notion of indigeneity, of being native, as it's been constructed in the whole colonial process up until today. And so I, as an individual person, as an educator, as a parent, now I'm really concerned, more than I was before in a theoretical sense, about what's going on in the minds of Indigenous people and how is the country and how are the institutions and how are other people responding to our efforts to redefine what it is to be Native. And the project that Paige alluded to that I didn't tell her about is more of a creative exploration of the idea of what it is to be Indigenous. I mean, I've been in academia for quite a while now, not as long as some people, it seems, in the room, but probably longer than most people. I've been thinking about these things and been active in the Native community in terms of activism, politics, and so forth since the mid-'80s, and have gone through certain phases. And I always kind of preface my remarks here to sort of give people an indication of where I'm at on these questions. At one point, I was really concerned with indigeneity in terms of a political movement. Not so much concerned with it these days because of a lot of things that I'm going to talk about here in terms of what that political movement has become, but also in terms of thinking about decolonization, colonization and decolonization in a deeper way. It's moved me away from considerations of politics and economics and economic analysis and policy engagement and so forth to really looking at the effects of the colonial process on the individual in the transformation of our psychology, our personality, and on a really intimate level in the way we relate to each other on a family level, on a human level, the way we relate to our environment, and the way that we really think of ourselves. And of course, I am not unique or the first one to think about this and make no claim to that. In fact, I think that all of the literatures on colonization and decolonization from other parts of the world have focused on this as its central element in defining what colonization, decolonization is for generations now. The one that's had the most influence on me has been Frantz Fanon's analysis of the colonial mind, Albert Memmi and so forth. In my own books, I've really benefited from their thinking through these issues. And my own work in the last few years has really been an effort to kind of translate those understandings of colonization and decolonization to the context that we live in here. There's been very few Indigenous intellectuals in the realm of political studies that have adopted that kind of approach in looking at what colonization and decolonization is, and thus in the reconstruction of indigeneity. Most of our preoccupation has been in the process element of focusing on gaining power, gaining access to institutional power, and reconstituting our governments and in a formalistic sense. So this new direction for me, which was an older direction in other parts of the world, I think is something that is a collective movement on the part of Indigenous peoples. Now, once we realize, and maybe not realize so much, once we become aware in an emotional sense, in a kind of experiential sense, what those other pathways are leading us towards and the kind of dissatisfaction we have. I won't go so far as to say emptiness because, of course, they're constituted in something, but the dissatisfaction that we have as people, as communities, as families, as a movement, as a whole, with the results of a political or an economic conception of decolonization is becoming more and more of a factor in people's consideration of what they want to do with their time, what they want to think about, what they want to do, the kind of things they want to devote themselves to. And so for myself, of course, I am a Native person. I'm engaged. I'm participating like everyone else in this as an actor in addition to an observer. And so my own trajectory has gone from being a person really seriously involved in the political and the economic side of things to a person considering these psychological, cultural dimensions. And I think that my own understanding of what colonization, decolonization is has been deepened by that engagement, that different type of engagement. So I'd like to share some reflections and thoughts on that with you here tonight. The central task, of course, of anyone who's engaged in a decolonizing effort is to recover the identity and the sense of what it is to be an Indigenous person that was stolen and remade for purposes other than that which assisted us in living a good life. There's all kinds of analysis that I could spend if I did have 3 hours going through the history of the specific interactions here in North America that resulted in us thinking of ourselves in the 1950s and 60s in terms that had barely any connection to that authentic existence of our ancestors. We collectively, as Indigenous people, were almost wholly remade, certainly in the eyes of the Canadian and American public, but tragically, I would say, in our own eyes as well. I think about in our own communities, in my own experience, going to look at ceremonies, going to participate in Native type of events when I was a child, and this wasn't that long ago, in the 1960s. I was a little child in the 70s and so forth, and think back to the imagery that comes back to me when I think about these type of engagements, and very little of it had to do with any type of historically accurate representation of Iroquoian peoples or Mohawk peoples. A lot of it was reflective of a process of trying to emulate the image of a native as it was constructed by the larger society. And what means does the larger society use to construct an image of the native? Well, art, literature, movies, television, and so forth. And so from the time I was a child, I have been, and I think everybody of my generation has been bombarded by images of what it is to be a native that served someone else's purpose, but left us with a huge gap in our own understanding of ourselves, in our own soul, really, that is, I would argue, largely responsible for many of the psychological and social pathologies, the problems in our communities that are fundamentally related to a lack of a sense of purpose and a lack of a sense of understanding about who we are as a people. So these are not just interesting questions on a kind of artistic level or a cultural critique level. These are serious questions for Indigenous people, and the work that's being done here in terms of people coming to understand themselves better as through representations, whether it's objects or art or literature and so forth, is crucially important. I've come to realize, I used to think it was all about politics, and I used to think it was all about money, and I used to think at one point, although I haven't really disabused myself of this completely, that it was all about contention and fighting to gain our land back. You know, it's all of those things, of course, but if we disregard these contestations over the representation of ourselves and the understanding of ourselves, then I think that we're spinning our wheels on those other aspects. And so that's where the title, I think, which actually Neil and I worked on together. So if you like it, we'll take credit. If you don't like it, he did it, and he forced me. From noble savage to righteous warrior. Don't be put off by the word righteous, actually, because I know the connotation in English language use is righteous is, somebody walking like that. I guess there is that sense of it at some times, but righteous warrior comes from a discussion in a book that I wrote called Wasaze, and it comes from an Iroquoian teaching, and it's not so much righteous in that sense as more akin to a sense, carrying yourself with a sense of justice and rightness. So focus on the right aspect of it and not righteousness. And so the theorist that I mentioned earlier, Fanon, has been greatly influential and helpful to me in understanding and unpacking and helping me become critically engaged with all of the efforts that are ongoing on the part of Native people in these communities to remake these images and to remake an identity and to really develop one that's meaningful for our people. And when I use the word authenticity, that's really what I mean. Hopefully people are not responding again to the word authenticity in terms of a sort of essentialist dismissal of anything that doesn't reflect this kind of museum-like image of a native. That's not at all what I mean. When I say authentic, what I mean is that it's rooted in our culture, that there's a true link to the community and that it has a real meaning for our people and helping them make good choices to live a good life according to our teachings. And so that's what I mean by the use of that word. I bring in Fanon because I love to talk about Fanon, and in so many ways, his work, particularly for those that know his work, there's one section of it where he talks about, in particular, the artist and the writer and literature and intellectuals, I guess, going through certain phases in coming out of the colonized mentality and the colonized existence and kind of recreating themselves in the decolonizing process. And if I'm correct, he outlines 3 phases. And I've always been, since I've come to this place and trying to think through these things, I've always been fascinated by those 3 phases and realized, and I'll convey to you, that there are not obviously chronological phases. So in any movement, in any country, among any people, and even within any individual, it's not like a chronological movement from one to the other. These are things, I think, that gradually progress, and hopefully people come to the 3rd phase, but realizing, and I'll talk about near the end of my talk here, how they all kind of play off against each other at all times, because people are different and communities are different and things happen at different paces at different times. But the first phase obviously is emulation in Fanon's estimation. When people decide to or get involved in a decolonizing movement, the first thing they want to do is prove that they're just as good as their colonizer. And so he outlines brilliantly, the psychological aspects of it from basic attitudes towards oneself. He even gets into sexual preferences and so forth and all these kind of things. But the emulative phase, I think, is something that every individual who awakens to the fact that they're colonized begins with. And I told I'd say some provocative things, so I'm talking for all of us. We're all kind of emulative to begin with, and if you disagree with me, hopefully we'll have some time to argue about that at the end. But you think about what I just referred to when I was a child in Kahnawake. I can recall going to an event which was supposed to be our Mohawk cultural days and seeing people dressed in firemen's outfits, people dressed in suits like I am today, people actually trying to activate their sense of self and to act on their sense of self in ways that were very, very reflective of what the outside society saw as success, as validating a useful and honored purpose in life. And so whether it was occupations, whether it was the way you carried yourself, most tragically in our communities, and I think in all Native communities, it was the English language. How many people who are Indigenous can recall their grandparents telling them, "No, you don't talk the Native language. You talk English if you want to succeed." That seems so bizarre today to a younger person who's being taught about culture in this last phase that I'll get to. But when we were growing up, that was actually, I think, the most common sentiment, is that if you wanted to handicap your child and force that child to live in poverty, in a marginalized existence, the best way to do that would be to teach them their language and to make them emulate not the white society, but the ancestors. And so that's just a kind of anecdote of the kind of larger process of what this movement, this indigenous movement, went through in terms of what is it to be successful, what is the good way. Well, it's that way, whether it's Christianity, whether it's liberal thinking, whether it's the mores and so forth, whether it's choosing a marriage partner or anything like that. It was very, very clear that whatever else went on in that relationship, the good choice, the successful person, chose the thing that really held you in esteem on the part of the white society. Now, Fanon outlines how people move through that on an individual level and on a collective level oftentimes. And as so happens in life and in nature, things go the opposite extreme. And that's nativism. And nativism is, well, you know, we're not white, and what we need to do is to really emphasize in an extreme way and to take as much as possible the position that natives are native and everything needs to be native, and dismiss everything white, and really build up and try to restore in many different ways, and in every different way, I should say, that element in you which is native. And that means just taking. And even if you don't relate to it, even if it's not true to your family history, even if it's not true to your community, something that was not white, and making that part of who you were. And so similarly, another anecdote from my growing up, from the nativist phase, I think, in our community, a few years later, you know, when I was in my teens, this would be in the late 70s, seeing people at that same kind of community gathering now wearing Plains Indian headdresses, bone chokers, riding horses, you know, riding in the community parade on a horse in a Plains Indian headdress in a Mohawk community. That's nativism. And that's the cultural representation of what is to be native. On a political level, on a larger cultural level, there's all kinds of manifestations of this too, with red power and AIM and so forth. The most interesting part of this process is, I think, the one that we're finding ourselves coming into, this process of decolonization and the kind of the shift from the emulation to the nativism, is really, after experiencing both of those, coming to realize as people who are thoughtful in engaging with these, that the useful and meaningful position is one, of course, that doesn't dismiss our reality, which is constituted in large part by our engagement with white society and European society, but which also doesn't give over to the fact that that is who we are. And so it's really trying to find a way to be in this modern colonial reality, but not of it. You know, how do we maintain ourselves as Ongwehue in our language, as true people, as Iroquois peoples, or whatever other nation we're from, and still be cognizant of the realities of the society, and not be kind of a comic of ourselves and dismissing everything that doesn't reflect our idealistic notions of Iroquoian culture. This is the struggle that we're facing right now. And you see it representing itself and being played out all over the place. You can walk into the next room, and I think that if you have walked into the next room and you see the exhibit, the Border Zones exhibit, you'll see the work of Marianne Nicholson, which I was asked and was very honored to comment on and to write a companion piece for. And my reaction to her work was right along the lines of what we're talking about here. And her and I sat down for a couple of hours and talked about it. And we hadn't had that chance before. And amazingly, I think we find ourselves at the same place. I'm able to articulate it through words, and she was able to articulate it, I think, through the art that she does. But it was about that. It was about taking tradition, is about taking who we are and regenerating it, so that we maintain our connection to our ancestral values and philosophies, but at the same time, not bowing down to tradition as well. And so for her, the question of boundaries and so forth was one that was constantly on her mind, that she was constantly trying to negotiate and to figure out. And same thing with me. You know, for her, it's how much do you show? I think that's what her piece is about. You know, for who is art done? Is it done as a display in the emulative phase to say, I can be an artist too, I have technique, I can do things, I can make grandiose works of art? Or is it just for us? Should it be behind a curtain? Should it be just in the langhao? Should it be hidden? Should there be all kinds of borders in terms of who can access this knowledge? And we've gone back and forth. And in fact, there are people in both of those camps, so to speak, working in our communities today as writers, as artists, as political actors, and so forth. But I kind of said that we're at the same place because we both agree we haven't got it figured out. It's something that bothers us. It's something that is a preoccupation. And I guess where we agree is that we both really need to focus on that and get people thinking about that as the next phase of our movement in terms of not allowing people to take the two easy ways. You know, the two easy ways are the noble savage and the kind of righteous warrior. Okay, we want to engage with both of those. The noble savage is a creation of the European mind. In the old days, it was meant to create an enemy that could be easily destroyed or marginalized or explained away as a thing of the past so that the European society could then validate its existence in this territory. I think there's still a bit of that going on, or a lot of it, in the sense that the noble savage is still present. The noble savage is still present in Canadian and North American culture. Slightly different take on it, though. Now my reading of it is that the noble savage is no longer being pushed away, marginalized, or killed off. The noble savage is being embraced as a brother and sister so that they can be a connection and a legitimation of European colonial society in this land. So people have realized that yes, we do need to have a legitimate connection to this territory. There needs to be an inheritance. There needs to be a line of succession, so to speak. And so that's where the noble savage comes in, the good Indian. The good Indian says, yes, you do have a place here. Yes, all you need to do is listen to me, buy my art, invite me to the Olympics to perform, all these kind of things. And I will sit behind you and smile while the Prime Minister and the Premier take all the glory and get to say, yes, this is Canada, and Michael J. Fox can get up and say, everybody in the world, this is your land too, right? And then that's the noble savage. So not to be too harsh on my friends and relatives, because of course I have relatives who participated in the opening ceremony and so forth, but you know, to be critical and to respect what's going on enough to actually think about it in a serious way and what's happening. So the noble savage is alive and well for a different purpose today. Look at the work of John Ralston Saul in his most recent book. You know, he's talking about Canada. Where does he's critical of right-wing conservative dismissals of Aboriginal culture as backwards and so forth. He's embracing. But where does he end up with in his book? His argument, John Ralston Saul's end argument, is that we are a Métis society and that we always have been, that we've been in denial. But what is he really saying? And I said this to him in conversation. I said, he asked me what I thought about it, and I said, you know what? I think what you're saying is that you have a right to be here and that you have a rightful ownership of this land. That's a reading of it, is that if you are a Métis society, what's Métis? Half European, half Indigenous. Your Indigenous half obviously is completely legitimate in everything that you're claiming and doing here. So there's a huge problem there, I think, in the way that the notion of a native is reflecting on an ongoing basis the noble savage. We've tried in various ways through art and literature to get away from that, but it is the main and the most attractive image of the Indian for mainstream society. The other one has always been a very, very difficult thing for non-native society to get a hold of and to understand and to certainly accept. But think about it in the most contemporary way, and then we'll back up. At the opening ceremonies, the 4 host nation chiefs were late. Why were they late? Because they were being protested by Indigenous warriors, female and male, blocking out the caravan that was leading to the ceremony. And so, I mean, it led to a totally unfortunate reiteration of a bad stereotype. The natives were late, and the whole Olympic ceremony had to wait for 20 minutes. But at least the Governor General was late with them. Although that's another stereotype, you know, they got so, you know, it was hard to win on that night, but everything turned out all right. I think in the end, everybody got there. But think about the playing off of the noble savage, the good Indian, and the bad Indian. Think about the way the media, comments of people, of your friends or anybody, the general public and so forth, to the two types of redefinition of what it is to be a Native person played out on the ground in this kind of fulcrum of the Olympics. The iconic symbol of the righteous warrior being something that I'm proud to say came from my hometown, from a person that I knew a little bit, not too much, but the warrior flag. Everybody knows by now, I think if you watched the news in the last little while, the red flag with the Indian head and the sun, the beams of the sun coming out. That was originally a flag for the warrior society in Ganawage, the community that I come from, but has since taken on a completely different meaning, and symbolizes, I think, their reaction to not only the noble savage, but also a sense of indigenous revolution in a cultural sense, in a political sense, and in every way. And so that flag is waved around at protests and at assertions of people who are acting on a sense of indigeneity, which is, I think, reflective of not as would be easy to dismiss nativism, not nativism at all. They are actually trying to activate a sense of what it is to be indigenous that means something for their people and is not simply satisfying the expectations of the larger society. And so the other side of the coin, in terms of me kind of provocatively making fun of a little bit the chiefs of the four host nations, in terms of their posture, I don't mean to disrespect them, but I mean to say that what kind of signal does it send when you have a display of regalia for the purposes of legitimating a relationship, when that is not really the kind of clothing that they wear every day. It's not the kind of thing that people really have as part of their everyday life, whereas the people who are outside in the street waving the flag, dressed the way they were, doing the kind of things they do, are actually living out an authentic indigeneity, which they live every day, which is their commitment, which is something that they do not instrumental to a political objective or anything, but is truly who they are. And so not to dismiss totally the utility of what was done by the four host nations or anything like that, but it is performative. And to get back to what Marianne and I agreed on, the thing that bugs her the most about Native art today is the performative aspect of it, and how so little is channeled back into educating our youth in terms of who they are. And so little of it is actually done for Native youth and Native communities. And so much of it is done for the market. Now, of course, the instantaneous response in people's mind is, well, you got to live. You have a job at the university. What are you doing? People need to make a living. But at the same time, I think that's obviously true. But people have to think about the usefulness and the uses of the work that they're doing. And if they call themselves Indigenous artists, Indigenous writers, Indigenous professors, activists, and so forth, what is the end result? And what is the effect of the energy that they're putting into their work and the environments that they produce that work for? So her piece, I think, is a commentary on where the actual utility of Indigenous traditions lies. You look at it, and it goes against the instinct of the person coming to see Native art. You come to see Native art, you're looking for really beautiful and technically brilliant displays of craftsmanship, impressive, usually Kwagilt or Haida designs and so forth. Increasingly, I'm happy to say, Ko Salish designs, as the big display in the Royal BC Museum proves. You're expecting to see all that, but you don't get that. You get a blank on the outside. On the inside is where everything is. And on the bottom, you see the pictures of the faces of those people from the ancestors. And so I think her message is that artistic production, artistic work, literary work, and so forth, is for those people inside. People can come and look, but they better have a respectful posture when they're looking at it. It's not something that is there for the taking, that is there for the use. And that, in fact, if you're useful to anybody, it should be for those ancestors and those younger people who have to reconnect to those ancestors in order to survive. Not to prosper, as we're finding, not to do anything else, but to survive. That's how crucial it is this time. Look at the suicide rates, look at all of the problems in our communities, and art matters, literature matters, philosophy matters, all these things matter because we're not doing them for us anymore. We're doing it in large part for other people, and we're living with the results because our communities are becoming, I used a phrase that was taken from Leroy Littlebear, he's a Blackfoot philosopher, decultured. What do you have when you have you're all experts on culture and so forth. In a decultured environment where there's other stressors, the economic stressors and health stressors and so forth, you get a disaster, a social disaster. And in fact, that's what's happening in our communities. So there's a very compelling need to really look at these questions in a serious way. And whether you're an artist, a writer, a professor, or anything else, an intellectual of any sort, and a political actor of any sort, we really have to consider, I think, the necessity of channeling back into the question of what is it to be a Ongwe today in our society, and giving the younger generation of people something meaningful to work with. You know, we're not going to solve their problems by the work that we do as intellectuals, but I think what we can do is give them the tools. Right now, the tools they have to work with are very poor. The cultural foundation, I use this kind of metaphor a lot because it was one that was given to me. The cultural foundation that our ancestors stood on to confront the challenges that they faced was huge. It was as big as this stage, if you want to think about it as a rock. You know, that's their language, their culture, their knowledge of history, their ceremonial engagement, their social connections, their spirituality, and so forth. It was a huge rock that they stood on. They could successfully engage a lot of different challenges at the same time and maintain themselves. Over time, though, what we've seen is that because of the bleeding away of energy, of people, of the direct attacks on our culture and our communities, that cultural foundation has been whittled away to the point now where I had a student who come to me this week, and this is a graduate student who comes from a nation of people who said, you talk about that big rock foundation. She goes, I feel like I'm carrying around a little pebble. She goes, that's how I feel right now. And what can I do carrying around this little pebble? What right do I have to even say anything? And so the question of art and culture and writing and all these sorts of things in education is so crucial and so much more important, I believe, today than the kind of negotiations we're having over political agreements and funding and so forth. There's a lot of people doing that, I think, because it's, ironically, the easy thing to do. The central fact about all this, as Fanon alludes to, as every writer who's written from a decolonizing perspective, and those of us that have lived and thought seriously about it, is that it's a very personal and difficult challenge to face. It's much easier to say, oh, it's all about money. I'm Clarence Louie, and you know, all it takes to decolonize is us starting businesses. Hey, all you natives, pull your socks up. You know, pull your socks up. Get to work on time. That's the verbatim. Those are the things that come out of that perspective. Really? Is that what decolonization is? In a less harsh way, the promises that are made in treaty negotiations about once we have our own form of government, things will fall into place. No. If you look at this, if you look at the people that have number one, signed and implemented treaties and begun living in those arrangements, it's not solving anything. Problems are getting worse. I focus on what I'm focusing on, and I'll finish with this, because of the example that works. Part of my own understanding is experiential, but part of it is also visiting and working with people that have really successfully maintained their indigeneity, and not only maintained it, but made it larger and shared it with others so that people can actually come to a sense of indigeneity that allows them to be in this world without having to suffer that big gaping hole in their soul. And that has always been through cultural resurgence. The classic example, if you were a bunch of anthropologists, I wouldn't have to refer to anybody else but the work that was done by Adrian Tanner and people like this in northern Quebec among the Cree. In Quebec, in the eastern part of Canada, there are communities that were very recently affected by industrial development, in the 1970s actually. And previous to that, they had been living a relatively traditional existence on the land right up until the 1960s and 70s. And then you had this sedentarization. And I won't go on too long about it, but I will tell you the central lesson. The central lesson was that through the consistent maintenance of a connection to that traditional lifestyle through cyclical camps, through art, through ceremony, through spirituality, those people who engaged in that culture were able to maintain themselves because that became the normalcy. And the messed up existence of the Indian Reserve became the thing that was bizarre or odd or the thing they had to deal with. Right now, we have it the opposite. In most Native communities today, what's normal is very, very sad. What's normal is lateral violence, sexual abuse, drug and alcohol, all kinds of very mean and destructive things that become the normal in the community. Even in those two other pathways that are laid out for success, what's the norm? Materialism? All these sorts of things are laid out, and it's not satisfying. What this pathway of cultural regeneration, moving towards this sense of being Indigenous that is kind of a resurrection of an older way of being Indigenous, but in a conscious engagement with the larger society, is really the fact that it normalizes that person and gives a sense of self, which is honorable, which is something that actually teaches people how to be on the land, how to treat each other with respect, all the values that are universal and reflected in Indigenous teachings, even if it's only for a part of the year, even if it's only for a part of someone's life, that becomes the normalcy, and it shields them with armor, psychologically, emotionally, and culturally, so that they can then do battle with the reality of their lives on the reserves and in the cities. And so when I talk about from noble savage to righteous warrior, that's really what I'm talking about. And I think that my own experience, that of our students, and then collectively, I think people are coming to realize this too. So all of us that are teachers, writers, students, and activists, I think we really need to think about the pathway to decolonization in these terms, because our survival depends on it. Not because it's a good thing to do, but our survival depends on it. We're at a crucial stage in our history, and there won't be any Indigenous nations around here to speak of 2 or 3 generations from now if we don't move in this direction. Now I'll go. Thank you. And thank you. Thanks. Thanks. And I told the young lady that if I go over half an hour, she can stand up and go like this, but I didn't get the yank, so we might have some time, I don't know, but I'll have to defer to Neil. If there are any questions or comments, it's up to you all. I'm here. If not, I'm happy to call it a night too.
Anybody wants to have just a couple quick reactions?
Yeah. Well, thank you very much, because this has been quite a trip, quite a journey, a series of itineraries here. And it reaffirms, some of the feelings and some of the hunches coming from South America, where, the concept of Métis, it has a different reality, which is, the mestizo, the Ladino, the cholo, the mixed blood, a reality that is obstructing the possibility, to regain strength in our indigeneity. And we are talking about a country, a region of more than 570 million people, but where indigeneity is still well rooted, in many communities throughout, Latin America. And I share, your views about indigeneity. My question is, if indigeneity goes just for, Indian communities, Indian people, or the Colis for everybody?
Thank you. Thanks for the question. The tradition that I come from and the communities that I come from are very explicit in answering the question that it's for everybody. It's a philosophy of life. And I think like other philosophies of life, it's not meant just for one family. It's actually a confident view that this is reflective of the best lessons that humans have learned and messages that they've been given about the way to live as a human being. So the central tenet of the culture that I come from, the Guyana-Regoa, it doesn't say the great law for Native people. Guyana-Regoa means the great good way of being, right? That's, in answer to your question very succinctly, it's for everybody. And I think that there were similar ideas reflected and represented in cultures all over this world, but unfortunately industrial civilization has crushed those or obliterated them. And to a large extent, indigenous peoples all over the world, not only North America, are the ones that are closest to those ways of being, which can take human society on a different trajectory than the one that we're on. You know, like, well, Einstein, a great Western thinker, you can't get the solution from within the problem. Well, the other solutions are all of those indigenous philosophies about how to live in relation to each other and the earth. And that's not the answer, but it's the pathway. It's the way that can take us in a different direction. If we all agree that we're headed towards a place where we don't want to go, with global warming, with nuclear Armageddon, with all kinds of things, well, here's the way to think about these questions. And so, yes, there needs to be a much greater engagement with us as the righteous warrior and not the noble savage who's just saying things to make that other society feel good about itself so that it can have a place at the table, so to speak. So a contentious, a respectful engagement where there is disagreement, where there is learning, where there is sharing, where there is discomfort, in order to relearn what it is to be human on both sides. Because we have to learn the new reality, while the other side would have to learn some new thinking about how to use that power that it has. So,
yeah. Thank you very much for your talk. It was very, very enlightening. I got a lot out of it, and gotten out of the last 3 days, not only amongst these little halls here to listen to speakers, but also engaging amongst my colleagues and my friends as we struggle with a lot of different issues ourselves, individually and collectively, as who we are, because it's been an interesting weekend because I didn't realize that it would be this engaging, not only on this level here, but also in our level that we have to deal with at home. It's a good reminder to think about our ancestors, but also think about our children, because I think it's been a very interesting theme that's been throughout all of these 3 days, at least from where I'm coming from. And when I think of myself as being Indigenous and listen to some of the speakers and not try to get too offended by what's being said sometimes, because it can get quite offensive. And, we've learned to be tolerant and learned to be patient, to listen to what people are trying to say. And for me, I feel like that there's a movement that's growing amongst the intellectual community. But at the same time, I think the movement that we need to have engaging amongst Indigenous peoples is exactly what you were just talking about, which is that when you're doing art, you're supposed to be doing it for your children. You're not supposed to be doing it to sell. And we had a good conversation a little bit about that earlier, where we started talking about high to form lines to a certain degree, but also just what are we doing it for? So I just think that I really enjoyed what you had to say, because it's a great reminder, and I hope that we can kind of continue that dialogue further amongst ourselves, with all due respect to our colleagues and people sitting around the room. But I think we've been kind of scraped and looked at for a long time, and I just feel like it's time for us to kind of dialogue amongst each other about how we feel about these issues, because they're very prevalent, and you're very correct in reminding all of us about what kind of issues are in every community. It's the same in our community, and it's very sad what's going on. And we can come up here and be real noble and righteous and do all of these things and go home to that.
Yeah.
And that's not very good. And so I think I just wanted to kind of connect with you at some point, but try to figure out a way where we can continue this kind of dialogue, so that there's that reminder that we need to have that conversation, because so many things are going on, and the Olympics just happened and all that kind of stuff. But the fact that we're still here, and the fact that we still have a culture to even talk to you guys about, is very amazing. And just being able to honor those people that came before us. We've still not had that great potlatch to honor those people that came before us. We've had little ones, but not ones where we actually talk about what great people those were that were able to survive all of those atrocities that happened to them. So thank you very much for your talk. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello, my name is Dorothy Christian, and I'm from the Secwepemc and Scales Nations from the interior of BC. And I'm currently writing my MA thesis on visual representation of all those, the savage and the warrior. And I'm happy to hear that I'm on track.
In my humble opinion.
In terms of indigeneity and all the rest of it. So,
and as a person who's been in your movies?
Yes,
at least once.
I have interviewed you. I have to acknowledge that. I have a piece of information that I would like to share with you, and I would like to ask where you would, or how you would fit it into your analysis. And it has to do with the Olympics as well. And again, with all due respect to the chiefs who were representing us all there, I don't mean to be disrespectful either. But on the Saturday, I had dinner with one of the interior chiefs on the 20th. And I was expounding to him about how embarrassed I was that these chiefs were late. That they were given this so-called nation status, and then they were embarrassed us all about being late. And he said that he had called Bill Williams and asked Bill, what's up with you guys? You're making us look bad. And Bill said that they were, in fact, rerouted on the motorcade because of the warriors. And they got to the building, and security rushed through Stephen Point and Campbell, but they held back the chiefs. So when the state still has that kind of control over our four host nation chiefs, where does that factor into the analysis?
Yeah, interesting. All kinds of things to talk about there, Dorothy. For people who don't know, who are not from British Columbia, Stephen Point is actually an Indigenous leader who's also the lieutenant governor of the province. So it's interesting to kind of think about this thing in this framework, him, and what he's representing and so forth. So the thing that I found, like my initial reaction to that, to the whole thing, didn't actually center on them being late. I thought about that later, but my reaction, being a person who's always formerly obsessed with politics and so forth, and critiques of the band system and all that, was those guys aren't representing the hereditary nations. They don't represent the Musqueam and all that. They're band council chiefs. These are chiefs installed in participating in a system that was imposed on our people and goes against all of the hereditary and ancestral rights that they are claiming to represent by wearing their regalia. So they're... I know. They actually, and some of them are sort of hereditary chiefs as well, but it's in carrying... The only reason they're sitting there is because they're the band chiefs. And so for me, it was about the misrepresentation. And again, it was kind of, that's why I put it squarely in the noble savage thing. I didn't problematize it as much as I could have, because I focused on that element of it, which was here are two band council chiefs. The only reason they're sitting there, 4 band council chiefs, is because the 4 band councils agreed to work with Van Ock in promoting and conducting the Olympics. That is the reason why they're sitting there. And there was the kind of honoring given as a kind of bargain for their acquiescence to the Olympics happening on their territory. And so there were all kinds of things given to them, funding, access, and this was one of them. But then the irony and the maddening part for me was they didn't have hereditary chiefs there, they had band council chiefs. And so it was, again, another kind of smokescreen to who we really are. You know, it would have been much more difficult to critique, I think, if they had clan mothers, elders, people who weren't somehow affiliated with their primary role being the band council. And so my initial reaction was that. And so my analysis, as it fits into my analysis, you're asking me, is simply that fact. Yeah, they are servants of the state and they are serving a role. And so they'll be treated as servants of the state. And I worked in the band council system, as you know, for a while as an employee, as a consultant and so forth. And my friends and relatives are in band council like every other Native person here. We know what it's like. You think that you're doing this, but actually you're doing that. If you want to be a band counselor, that's what you are. And I think that situations like this, unfortunately, for those people who imagine themselves as decolonizing in that pathway, they get reminded over and over again. And one of my friends called me up, maybe at the same time your friend was calling Bill Williams, saying, wow, he says, this reminds me of when I saw these picture books of the British in India and Africa, when they used to take out the conquered chiefs and put them on display, just like us. And I said, yeah, we endured that as well. You know, we had chiefs on display at various points in our history. And he goes, oh, it's still going on here. And so that was a younger person's, a politicized younger person's reaction to it as well, just to kind of give a slightly different take on it than myself, but a political reading I had, I guess, and fits in there.
Okay, two, because we, unlike the band council chiefs, don't want to be late for our next. And people can speak to Taiaiake in the lobby as well.
Great, thanks. I just want to speak about gender because you don't really refer to the differences between noble savage and righteous warrior. If you could talk about the differences, because there are differences. Thank you.
Oh yeah, I mean the parallel. I would say it's maybe the other side of the coin, to use a different kind of analogy, is the Indian princess on this side, and I was counting lucky. One of my main teachers was Gail Guthrie. Her married name was Vals Kakis, but she did a lot of work on this notion of the Indian princess as kind of the female counterpart to the noble savage. And so, yeah, there's an image. It's all over Land O'Lakes butter, all kinds of things in contemporary Native culture. Again, what purpose does it serve? It's a sexualizing. It's a kind of putting in her place the Native woman as a servant of the Native, or at least delivering up something to the non-Native society. And her analysis, I think, is awesome in terms of it's getting to the depth of the kind of usefulness of the image of the Indian princess to non-Native society. Devin Maheswa is another scholar who's focused on this as well. So the counterpart being the Indian princess. Over here, I don't really need to do other side of it, because there's females that are just as much of the righteous warrior as males. And so I'm a male talking, and I tend to talk as a male, relate male experiences and stuff like that. But as I learned in researching and then writing and then speaking about the book that I did on that concept of warriorism, Wasaze, most of the warriors that we have in our community are women today. And so when I did 13 portrayals of pathways of warriorism for that book, the majority of them are women that I portrayed. And so, yeah, thank you for giving me a chance to kind of bring that point forward. The concept of the warrior is something that I wanted to kind of remake out of the older image of what an Indian warrior was, and I kind of played with the idea, and in a provocative way with the book cover, which is your classic Indian Mohawk warrior standing there with a war club fully painted and everything like that. But once you start reading it, you start seeing, well, most of the people he's talking to are women. And most of the people who are giving him lessons on what it is to stand up and put yourself in between a place of danger and your community today, the ones who are doing it in very creative, courageous ways, they're all women. So it's kind of a counterintuitive take on what the righteous warrior is. And I think you saw that in the Olympics protest. How many of the people who are out there? It can take a survey if you get the YouTube video and look at it, or just about the circle of friends that you know. I had in the circle of friends that I know, and students who are participating in that, more women than men, and I think that's generally the case, whether it's in education, the arts, physical contestations, protest, tends to be women. Why is that? That's a good question. Another question maybe for another discussion, but it's something that I certainly have dealt with in our classroom and in my book somewhat as to why it is that there are more women warriors than men warriors in our communities today. We'll leave that one for the next time, but I have some thoughts on it, but we can talk about that later if you want.
Oh, goody, I get the last word.
All right.
Neil said I can't ask you a question, I can only comment. I'm bringing it back to the Olympics because I'm Haida, and I got caught up in the opening ceremonies. I agree with what you're saying, but I got caught up in the opening ceremonies because there were 8 of our youth there participating. So when I was watching, I started crying because I said, I don't care if this is politics. The world is seeing that there are First Nations in Canada. And then what I completely missed, but my husband, who isn't Haida, saw, was that after they danced out, they got surrounded by white people that did the side shuffle.
Historically accurate show.
And they were totally in white, and one of my friends that was one of the youth in that was saying, you should have seen them dance. They were doing the side step real stiff. But it was, I know it wasn't intentional, but it worked out that way in the opening ceremonies, and that would be the last word, folks.
Well, one more is that at least it was better than with the Salt Lake City one, is because if you remember Salt Lake City, they had native singers and dancers and stuff, and then very abruptly pushed them off the stage, and stagecoaches and like cowboys came. It was like, wow, that is just brutally honest. At least they got to stay and dance for 2 hours.